does anyone want to summarize what the passage was about really quickly? Okay, so we'll break down the passage and go over the questions. So paragraph 1 was mostly addressing the war conflicts and how they would end. And then paragraph 2 actually said, no, there's going to be new conflicts. And paragraph 3 gave examples of the new conflicts. And then paragraph 4 introduced a model. And then paragraph 5 continued with describing how the conflicts are still going and how they're now asymmetrical. So for question 1, what did you guys say? Okay, yeah, so the wars have transformed because before they used to be between two groups. So this was mentioned in the last paragraph, how wars transformed and they were no longer binary. D is the best answer here. So we wouldn't say they used to be between asymmetrical because this is the new form. So we're asking for which one was the previous form of war. And that was, they used to be between binary groups. Okay, number 2. Okay, yep. So which of the statements will the author most likely agree with? So we were talking about war and how it has changed and now it involves different, even different strengths and powers. So B would be the best answer here. That's the main idea of the passage, how the war has changed. And now we're involving parties that are not equal in strength. C, armed aggression has the capacity to take different forms. This is really broad and it's difficult to tell if the author would agree with this in a way that was mentioned in the passage. But I think this one is the best answer just because the main idea of the passage best supports that and how the paragraph was talking about how there's different strengths involved.
I have a question, but
Yeah.
is the paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 both talking about how they transform the typical form to the other form of conflict?
Yeah.
And they give the example of the old struggle.
Yeah, so paragraph 2, we can go back. So paragraph 2 was talking about how there's new conflicts now, that the end of the Cold War did mark the cessation of many existing wars, but it did create grounds to end unrelated conflicts, but there was like the marking of a transition from one conflict to another. So now we're having different types of conflicts, and it tells us some examples of the Balkan Wars, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and it's saying these examples show that new conflicts involve combatants of different levels of power. So that's what this paragraph is saying.
So
And
in that
yeah.
case, would it support the answer C if you also include the example from the next paragraph?
Okay, let's go back. So, well, the second paragraph definitely said war involved parties that were not equal in strength. This one is too broad. B is exactly what the passage is saying. So do you see how right here it says these new conflicts involved combatants of different levels of power. So that is the same thing as B in that question. So that would be the best answer. Where are you seeing the best support for answer C? We could go over that too.
I thought in the beside the general idea of the paragraph 2, paragraph 3 topic sentence also first mentioned about how the old struggle will reconstruct into a new one, and then they give an example of Afghanistan and so Soviet withdrawal, and which like a leave US terrorists taking over the power.
Yeah, so these are saying old struggles. It's not saying the aggression. So question C says armed aggression has the capacity to take different forms.
And also on the second last paragraph, they're also talking about the consequence of the modern institution that's replaced by the regime. So would it become the different form of the other than the armed aggression?
So I think what you're seeing is a general inference, but since it actually says it directly, you have to assume that would be the best answer. If it directly quotes new conflicts involved different levels of power, and this is exactly what this is saying. War now involved parties that were not equal in strength. Does that kind of make sense where we're getting that from? C is really it's really broad to say that. So since we have direct quote in the passage, right here, these new conflicts involved different levels of power. This is the best answer because it says it directly in the passage. It's hard to find the evidence for C. It's more as an inference and assumption, whereas B is directly quotes it in the passage. So the author would definitely agree with something that is mentioned in the passage. That's what B is saying. Okay, moving on. What about number 3, guys? A, okay. So describing the tensions. Yeah, so we're looking for the best evidence that would support the old struggles and how they're restructured to new forms. That would be a yes. So that's telling us how the old structures, what the old structures were and how they were restructured. Does that make sense? Did anyone choose anything else? Okay. Number 4. So what was the theme of the passage? Yeah, so it's talking about how, so we're looking at the theme of the passage, how the Cold War led to new forms. So if the military is also leading to more and different actions, that is similar to how the Cold War is led to other forms. Okay, number 5. Which of the following provides the least support for the author's thesis? Okay, so most of the passage was finding the least support would definitely, we can start with this question by thinking what was provided in the passage. So this was actually mentioned in the passage that NATO supports the current government and the US and UN still intervene. This was also mentioned. So these are providing support. If the bombings ended peacefully, this is not providing support for the author's thesis, and we'll go over why in a second. D was also mentioned in paragraph too. So all of those, if they're mentioned in the passage, they're providing support. So C, the bombings ended peacefully. So if we go back to paragraph 2, so it mentioned here that bombings and seems to have created grounds to end some otherwise unrelated conflicts, such as the bombing. So it's not really mentioning that it's going to be peaceful. It's a rare example that ended the Cold War. It doesn't really offer the support because it's saying the bombings ended peacefully. So it's not really helping the author's thesis, which was saying that war involves different powers. So that's not one of the main ideas, whereas the other three are supporting them. Does that make sense? Since NATO supports the current government, that gave an example of how the old conflicts were transformed into new. If the US and UN are intervening, that's also showing how we're dealing with war and different levels of power. And the conflict in Rwanda was given as an example to support the author's statement. So C is not really adding anything to it. So that would provide the least support out of these options. Okay. Number 6. Okay. Yeah, so this was mentioned in, I believe, paragraph 4. So he was seen as an expert in the field, and he can explain what war was like before. So that's probably why he was mentioned, to explain what war used to be like. Okay. Last one. Yeah, that's great. So just by saying that a war is declared between two Asian countries, that's not really adding to the argument, and it's not really taking away, because we don't know, was one country stronger than the other, or was one country weaker? So it's not really relevant to the argument. So we need to know more information before we could see if this supports or does not support the author. Okay, do you guys have any other questions? If not, we're going to give you guys 2 passages to work on, and we'll give you around 20 minutes to do them.
Oh, I have a question. When I doing this passage, I have a hard time understand paragraph 4 and 5, and so I was not able to write down the short summary after each paragraph. In that case, what should I do?
Okay, so even
I
if you
think
don't,
if it was in
yeah, go ahead.
the real, I wouldn't skip this passage, but
Sorry, you're breaking up. Do you want to repeat that or type it in the chat?
oh yes.
Okay. Okay, you can go ahead and type it, and we can talk, but everyone else can go ahead and get started with the next 2 passages. Let us know once you guys are done.
Okay, so how did you guys find the passage? Easy, medium, hard? Okay, good. So these are my highlights. Again, I kept it very minimal to only 3 highlights. I first highlighted gonadal sex steroids because this is the first direct result of the increased hypothalamic pituitary gonadal activity. I then highlighted estrogen because this hormone causes lots of secondary sex characteristics. I finally highlighted size of testes because it is the first sign of puberty, which I didn't know. All right, any volunteers for the first question? Okay, why do you say B? Okay, so estrogen is secreted by the ovaries. In order for this secretion to occur, the ovaries must be stimulated by gonadotropins FSH and LH. In order for FSH and LH levels to rise, they must be stimulated by GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So A is wrong because TSH has no involvement in estrogen secretion. Progesterone also doesn't have anything to do with estrogen secretion. Prolactin, while it is important in inducing milk secretion, it doesn't actually cause estrogen secretion. So I included a picture of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axes to help you guys visualize this. Yeah, you're also right. GnRH is the main regulatory hormone. So the difference between progesterone and estrogen, they have different, well, during the menstrual cycle, they rise at different times. They also have different functions. It's a lot to go over, but basically the most important role of estrogen is that it causes ovulation. That rise in estrogen causes ovulation. Sorry. Yeah, estrogen causes LH to rise, which causes ovulation, and progesterone protects the endometrium. Right, estrogen establishes the endometrium, progesterone protects it. Any volunteers for the second question? Okay, so this is another recall question. The seminiferous tubules are the site of spermatogenesis. The synthesis of testosterone would take place in the interstitial cells in pink. The maturation of sperm would take place in the epididymis. By maturation of sperm, I mean this is where they get their ability to fertilize and gain motility. Fertilization takes place in the fallopian tubes of a female, so D is not an answer. I included the diagram I used to explain these terms in my topic session like last month. You can see the seminiferous tubules here where mature sperm are made from spermatogonia. The interstitials here in pink are stimulated by LH to make testosterone, and the Sertoli cells here are stimulated by FSH to nourish the spermatogonia as they become spermatozoa. Okay. Any volunteers for question 3? Okay, why do you say A?
Because according to the passage, this mentioned in the third paragraph, the third sentence, that LH will, hold on, the test is in the passage in the first sentence to the second sentence.
Right.
It basically describe the answer.
Okay. So this is actually sort of a trick question. The testicular size is caused by an increase in gonadotropin hormones LH and FSH. Growth hormone is not responsible for testicular growth. They only cause the growth of bones and skeletal muscles by reserving glucose so they could use them to grow quickly. So the phrase in the third paragraph that you're referring to, it indicates that FSH and LH are directly responsible for testicular growth. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, so this phrase of the passage is saying that the first sign of puberty is increase in the size of testes due to FSH. Then they start introducing LH. This is also responsible for increasing testicular size. Okay. And any volunteers for this question? Okay, why do you say A?
Since we need the gonadotropic releasing hormone for the LH and FSH, I just related it to that. And then the LH and FSH, they are related to testes to increase. That's what I should say.
Yeah, exactly. So you could also use the passage to answer this question. In males, the first sign of normal puberty is an increase in the size of the testes. So like we said, without GnRH, LH, and FSH cannot be secreted, so the young boy will not experience a growth in testicular size. B, C, and D would occur later because they're secondary sex characteristics, so this would be a result of decreased androgen or testosterone secretion. Okay, and any volunteers for this question? Okay, why do you say A?
Because the growth hormone, I think it's the steroid hormone, which the steroid hormone will usually transpass the lipid membrane and then bind into the receptor inside of the cytoplasm.
Okay, so growth hormone is actually a peptide hormone. So peptide hormones are unable to cross the cell membrane, so the protein cannot bind to GH in the cytoplasm. So A would be right if growth hormone was a steroid hormone. So for this question, you do need to know like your peptide hormones, your steroid hormones, your amino acid derived hormones. Those are all very important to know, which is why I'm bringing up the point of using Anki cards. I highly recommend. So B describes the mechanism of a peptide hormone. GH binds to a protein on the cell surface, which binds another protein, tyrosine kinase, to initiate a cascade of reactions. The question states that in normal cells, tyrosine kinase activity is dependent on the presence of GH. But in the tumor cell, tyrosine kinase activity was constant, meaning that it was always on. So this accounts for the uncontrolled cell growth that characterizes a tumor. So this sounds like the right answer. Let's take a look at C. Cancer is caused by unregulated tyrosine kinase activity. So C is saying that the kinase limits the effect of GH, but this is false. It causes growth. It does not limit it. D is similar to what C is saying. The abnormal activity of the kinase causes cell division uncontrollably, which causes cancer. So it did not prevent cell division. Does that make sense to everyone? Yes, I'm pretty sure there is an Anki deck that has all the peptides, hormones, and stuff. I will look for that and I'll let you know. Okay, any volunteers for this? Okay, why do you say B? Okay. No, yeah, no, I completely understand and relate. So GH, growth hormone, is secreted when stimulated by growth hormone releasing hormone. So you know how GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is made in the hypothalamus and causes the secretion of FSH and LH by the anterior pituitary gland. So the similar mechanism works for growth hormone. The hypothalamus makes GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary gland to release growth hormone. The question is asking about the hormone that causes the release of growth hormone. So D is our answer. A, the anterior pituitary gland, would be right if the question asked us what gland releases growth hormone, but it's not. It's asking us about growth hormone releasing hormone. B is wrong. The posterior pituitary gland only makes ADH and oxytocin. C is wrong. The bone and liver are the target organs of growth hormone. In other words, growth hormone acts on the bone and liver to cause gluconeogenesis for the bones and muscles to use for rapid growth. Yeah, for this question, I saw growth hormone and then I immediately hit A. So, it's really easy to just get like too confident in yourself. Yeah, okay. Any questions? Well, flat peg, the G in peg would be growth hormone. That growth hormone is secreted by anterior pituitary gland, if that's what you're saying. So flat peg is a mnemonic that I introduced in the topic session a few weeks ago. So I'll type it in the chat. All right, let me stop sharing.
Okay, how did you guys find this passage? Easy? Okay, that's good. Hopefully it was better than the other CARS passage. Okay, so let's break down this passage. So paragraph 1 was talking about the Neolithic enclosures, and paragraph 2 and 3 was the author was discounting other ideas that couldn't account for that. And paragraph 3 was also talking about how the corral and the entrances can also be excluded. Paragraph 4, we got to talk about what the author's opinion was and how it's more as in a religious impact. And he talks about that in paragraph 5 and 6 as well, how he mentioned feasting and human sacrifice as well. Okay, what did you guys get for number 1? Okay, so the explanation would be challenged by finding what? So the best answer here would be B, because if they would feast in their fortifications, that is going against the idea of the defensive fortifications, and the author excluded that idea. So that would definitely challenge the author. If we're claiming that they did this in defensive fortifications, where the author mentioned that they actually did it in the enclosures in the last paragraph. Okay, number 2. Okay, this is kind of tricky. So what is the assumption about the defensive fortifications as implied by the passage? Can anyone explain why D or why A? What made you want to pick those answers? So the defensive fortifications, that was mentioned in paragraph 2. So he said we can discount the defense and fortification, although this was what the first interpretation was. But if it was these military installations, we would expect more of these. And we can also expect traces of violence and destruction. So the author is saying there's none of these found. And the external bank in the ditch also speaks against this interpretation. Yeah, so that's what paragraph 2 is saying. So which assumption can we assume about the defensive fortifications? So if we have defense, why would we need that in the first place? So we're probably going to need that where there's going to be fighting involved or something like that. So A, we can't really assume that from the passage they were built near population centers. There's no mention of that. It doesn't really mention that they were built likely near population centers. B, also they were not needed. That's a little extreme. Even if it mentions such, it's saying that defensive fortifications were needed, and if they were needed, a lot more would be needed in the area just to defend a lot. So we can't say B either. So between C and D, they were usually surrounded by ditches. So we did talk about ditches in paragraph 2, but if we're saying that all the enclosures had ditches, they were used to help people to cross them. So it's not saying that all defensive fortifications have the ditches, because the author, by introducing ditches, they were saying that the enclosures had them to help people cross. So it's not saying all defensive fortifications should have had them. However, if we're saying C, which is the answer, we can assume that if the enclosures were defensive, we would expect to see violence. So if we're going to see violence, they're probably going to be in areas where there's going to be some debate about something. So they can easily be in lands where battle is going to happen, or if there's land that's contested, that means that the land is being questioned or debated upon whose land that is. So that's probably why the defense fortifications were there. Does that make sense? between C and D, why C is better? Yes? Okay, perfect. Number 3. So now we're talking about the enclosures and why they're not farm corrals. Yeah, so we mentioned the size. This was mentioned in the entrance. Okay, the author's attitude, number 4. Yeah, so the author seems really excited about saying that this was probably used for religious practices. He seems positive about this idea. So that is probably the best answer choice. Number 5. Yeah, so what was the main argument of the author? The main argument was that the Neolithic enclosures were not used for other things. It was actually used for religious purposes. So if we had something like how important was religion, we would know more about the author's argument and why it's important. So religion was key in the passage, so that's probably the best answer choice to understand more about it. Do you guys have any other questions on this passage? Okay, well, that's all we have for you today. So thank you so much. If there's any other questions on previous questions, we can go over that now.
Hi, I have a question on the passage that's similar to the post-Cold War that we did, the first passage we did for today.
Yeah,
Usually for that kind of passage, especially talking about a lot of dense history information or some kind of like a abstract philosophy paper, I usually would not understand like maybe 1 or 2 of the paragraph in the middle. And in that case, what should I do? Should I, when I see that, just automatically skip on the real endcap, or like is there a way to break down the passage?
Right. So I wouldn't suggest skipping the paragraph, but just finding at least 1 or 2 sentences that make sense to you. So for example, yeah, this paragraph was really dense, but I just wrote the Clausewitz model if I needed to come back to it. And there was one question on it, but it was really simple. It was just question about, I think it was question 6, right? Why was he mentioned? So in that big paragraph, the only question we got was, why was that person mentioned? And that's something we can definitely figure out, because he starts talking about how these 3 examples illustrate how the new armed conflicts did not consist of war between states in the conventional form. So he's saying how these examples are new conflicts and they weren't consistent of how war was analyzed before. So that's what the sentence 1 is saying. And he's saying the modern war has been analyzed by this person. So, and we're using an analogy to understand the new form of warfare in Europe. So that's basically what sentence 2 is saying. So you just kind of need to break it up, even though there's a lot of words that you might not understand. And then he's saying this person argued that there was evidence for a number of consequences from the modern institution that replaced Europe. So we're saying that there's a lot of consequences in the modern, and it's replacing older regimes. So that's kind of what we're going at here. And now we are having 4 examples. We get a first example, second example, third example. So all these examples can, for that question, all we need to know that he's explaining what the war used to be like. He's kind of an expert on it. We didn't need to understand that whole paragraph. So I know sometimes it's really confusing, but if you just try your best to understand the sentences that you can understand, it will help you in the end. So reading the first and last sentence, even if you don't understand the main paragraph, it can help. So the last sentence here says, even at the end, his model of war retains the idea of symmetrical encounter between two equivalent entities. So he has a model of war, and this model is saying that the idea of symmetrical still works. So that was the old idea where we have two symmetrical conflicts, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's what basically this paragraph is saying, and how he supports the old war, and because that was symmetrical. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's very helpful. Oh, and another question.
Okay.
Because the car is my weakest section, so I plan to using other section to pull up my average for my overall NCAP. And my target score is only like an average. So in that case, will I change any strategy that the way I study for the NCAP? If my goal is merely just meet the 50 percentile for the reading session.
Wait, sorry. What is the question exactly?
What I do differently if my
Oh, what?
goal is to just reach the 50 percentile on the car session.
Okay, well, we've been talking about the strategies in the car session. I definitely think,
It will be the same.
sorry, what?
So even if my goal is just 50 percentile, there will be the same strategy that you mentioned before in the previous session.
Yeah, I think the same strategies work regardless of what your goal is. I think if you're not getting 50%, you really need to work on reading comprehension. That's probably where most of your points are getting lost. So just understanding and breaking down the passage, going slowly at first, can probably help you more. So don't worry about timing right now. So maybe take your time on a passage and really try to understand what he's trying to say, what the author is trying to say, and go from there. And definitely use process of elimination and stick to the paragraph and what the author is saying. So you really want to think about each answer choice and kind of, it's like a game, you know, you have to really think about why the test makers are saying this versus that. But you can definitely email me. We can set up a session if you're still having a lot of trouble with cars.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, does anyone have any other questions?